At 6:45 a.m. on a regular Tuesday in Salt Lake City, Utah, a father and son lugged a heavy jewelry case into the lobby of a high-rise building. They ran a jewelry store together on the third floor, and they had come in early to set up their new display. They heard the lobby door open up behind them, and so they turned, and they saw a man holding a cardboard box. The man said he was making a delivery and asked them where the elevator was. The father and his son were heading towards the elevator anyways, so all three of them just got on the elevator together. As they stood in the elevator car as it brought them up, the father looked over at the box that the man was carrying. There was a name written on the top of it in black marker, but there was no return address, which seemed odd. And also, the man didn't really look like a delivery driver. He was wearing a green Letterman jacket like a high school athlete would wear. But the father just kept his thoughts to himself, and when the elevator doors opened to the third floor, he and his son carried their jewelry case out and went on with their day. But later that morning, a firefighter pounded on the jewelry shop door and said the building was being evacuated. The father and son rushed outside, where they saw fire trucks, police cars, and a crowd of other people who worked inside the building. As a woman in the crowd filled them in about what had just happened, a horrible realization dawned on the jewelry shop owner. That delivery man they saw on the elevator was not who he claimed to be, and the cardboard box he had contained something far more sinister than anything the shop owner could have imagined. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the Follow Button's office and break the lead tips off of all their pencils and then hide their pencil sharpener. Monday, October 14th, 1985 was Columbus Day, and Steve Christensen was marking the holiday by chasing his three young sons around his big sunlit living room. His wife Terry stood next to the fireplace, smiling with a hand on her very pregnant belly, and every time Steve looked over at her, he couldn't believe how beautiful she looked. She was absolutely glowing. Steve stopped running around to catch his breath. He was only 31 years old, but everyone said he seemed older, and today he felt older too. He was tall and broad-shouldered with thick brown hair and an air of seriousness about him. Steve's number one goal in life was to provide for his family, and he'd worked hard so they could have their nice home here in Salt Lake City, Utah. As his boys crowded around him, still wanting to play, Steve suddenly felt a pang of guilt. He knew he had not been spending enough time with his family lately because he had been so consumed with work. But Steve didn't feel like he had any other options. 2 months ago, the financial consulting company that he had helped build had gone under, leaving Steve almost bankrupt. Now he was trying to launch a new consulting business with a friend, and he was working overtime basically every week to get this new company off the ground. Steve told his sons they could play for a few more minutes, and so they did, and then afterwards he stood up and he walked over to Terry to rub her shoulders. He knew she was exhausted from the pregnancy and that she didn't like him working all the time, but Steve also knew he and his wife could make it through hard times. Not only did they have each other, but they also had their faith in the Mormon Church. Steve was a bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as the Mormons are officially known, and Terry was a devoted member. Literally half the population of Salt Lake City was Mormon, and Steve loved it. He and his growing family were surrounded by a big supportive community. But Steve's interest in Mormonism went well beyond his faith. He also collected historic Mormon artifacts like letters, books, and other documents that cataloged the church's past. Before his financial problems began, Steve used to buy and sell these 19th century antiques all the time. He'd even donated rare historical documents to the church. These days, though, he mostly helped arrange document sales for other people. He'd recently helped his friend, Mark Hoffman, who was a professional antiques dealer, get a $185,000 USD loan to buy some early Mormon letters. Not only that, Steve had tracked down a lawyer whose client was interested in purchasing the letters from Mark at an even higher price. Steve, Mark, and the lawyer were going to meet tomorrow morning to make everything official. But Steve didn't want to think about business right now. He just wanted to enjoy this rare day off with his family. He kissed his wife's shoulder and went back to playing tag with his boys. The next morning, Steve's alarm went off at 7 a.m. He dragged himself out of bed, got ready for work, grabbed his briefcase, and headed to the kitchen. Terry was in there making waffles for the boys, and she asked if Steve wanted to sit down and eat, but he told her he didn't have time. He was just going to grab breakfast on his way to the office, and so he gave his wife and sons each a kiss before heading out the door. Steve drove his Jeep towards downtown Salt Lake City, stopping to buy a box of donuts and a couple of cans of ginger ale on the way. Then he parked his car outside a huge 8-story high-rise building called the Judge Building, where his office was located. The judge building was filled with other shops and offices, and even though it was only 8 a.m., there were already plenty of people milling around. Steve waved to some of the familiar faces as he strode toward the elevator. Steve took the elevator up to the 6th floor, and as he approached his office door, he noticed a cardboard box sitting on the ground. It sort of looked like a box that might contain a big cake, like a big square, and on top of this box, written in black marker, it just said, "To Steve Christensen." Steve balanced the 2 cans of ginger ale on top of the box of donuts, and then he carefully bent down and used his free hand to pick up this box. At that same moment, Steve's new business partner, Randy Rigby, was weaving through traffic trying to get downtown. Randy was about 10 minutes late for work, and he'd been trying to page Steve and let him know he was on the way. Steve was not answering. And as Randy approached the judge building, he was quite surprised to see all these fire trucks and police cars outside, parked everywhere with their lights flashing and sirens going off. People were gathered around the building, looking curious and concerned. Randy scanned the crowd for Steve, whose tall, broad frame was always easy to spot, but he couldn't see him anywhere. Then he started looking for Steve's Jeep and noticed it parked nearby. Randy walked up to a woman who obviously was from the judge building, and he asked her, what's going on here? And she said the whole building had just been evacuated because of some emergency. She said she had no idea what this emergency was. Suddenly, Randy had an unsettling thought. What if Steve didn't know that he needed to get out of the building and he was still in there? Randy needed to make sure Steve was okay. So even though he could see police officers shooing people away from the main entrance, he decided to sneak in. Randy drove his car to the back entrance of the building and quietly slipped inside. He sprinted up 6 flights of stairs, burst into a long hallway, and looked at his and Steve's office door. Except there was no door. The entrance to their office was now a gaping hole framed by splintered wood and chunks of broken drywall. The hallway was littered with debris and coated in dust and ash. Randy's eyes looked to the floor, and he saw there were chunks of burned donuts and also 2 ginger ale cans that had been bust open. Then he saw his partner's mangled body lying amidst the wreckage. His business partner was so obviously dead that the emergency medical workers standing nearby weren't even trying to revive him. The scene was so horrible that Randy could barely process it. Staring at his lifeless friend, all he could think was, who's going to tell his wife? But then, a police officer grabbed Randy's arm and pulled him away from the area. He told Randy the building had been evacuated and he was not supposed to be here. Moments later, Salt Lake City police detectives Jim Bell and Ken Farnsworth reached the same hallway that Randy had just been kicked out of. The men made a good team. Bell was quiet and analytical, while Farnsworth was more talkative and outgoing. The veteran homicide investigators had worked a lot of cases together, but they'd never seen anything like this. Looking at the devastating scene, both detectives were at a loss for words. The victim, who they had learned was 31-year-old Steve Christensen, was unrecognizable. His chest had been blown open, his right foot was nearly severed off, and there were long, heavy nails lodged in his face. Farnsworth cleared his throat and said what both men were thinking. It looked like a bomb went off. The detectives put on gloves and spent the next hour combing the hallway and bagging potential evidence. They found a number of wires, a rocket igniter, and also a motion sensor switch, all items a person could use to build a homemade bomb. Just then, Detective Bell heard the elevator ding, and he turned and saw a scruffy man in a gray sports coat walk out. Jerry D'Elia was unique in the Salt Lake City Police Department. He was a prosecutor, he was also an arson expert, and he was an investigator. A native of New York City, D'Elia had more experience with bombing cases than anybody else on the force. Bell explained what they'd found so far, and D'Elia agreed that it seems like Steve had been the victim of a homemade bomb. But D'Elia said that whoever made it knew exactly what they were doing. Not only did they use a motion sensor switch, so the bomb would go off whenever somebody moved it, but they had also wrapped the explosives in nails that virtually guaranteed the bomber's target would be killed in the explosion. In fact, D'Elia said the bomb was so sophisticated that he wondered if maybe this was the work of a professional hitman. But as they discussed the possibility that Steve was killed by a murderer for hire, another police officer came running up the stairwell, accompanied by 2 men who looked very shaken. The men said they owned a jewelry store on the third floor of the Judge Building, and just that morning at about 6:45 a.m., they had rode the elevator up with a man who claimed to be delivering a package. And this man was carrying a cardboard box, and on the box it said, "To Steve Christensen." And so now that the jewelry shop owners had heard what happened, they were pretty certain they'd been inside the elevator with the bomber. Detective Bell asked if they recalled anything about the man's appearance, and the witnesses said he was Caucasian with brown hair, maybe in his 30s, and they remembered that he was wearing a green Letterman jacket. Bell looked over at D'Elia. A 30-something-year-old guy in a Letterman jacket didn't exactly sound like a professional hitman, because that kind of stands out quite a bit, and if you're a hitman, you want to be kind of under the radar. But then again, who was really to say what a real hitman looked like? Before they could talk it over, though, yet another police officer came barreling through the door from the stairwell, wide-eyed and breathing heavily, and he looked directly at Detective Bell and said, "We have another one." Shortly after 11 a.m., about 2 hours after this first explosion, Prosecutor D'Elia pulled up outside a home in the upscale Salt Lake City suburb of Holiday. He saw county sheriff's deputies, TV news reporters, and frightened neighbors crowded outside, all trying to make sense of the horrific scene. D'Elia parked his car, stepped out, and looked over at what was left of a nice brick house. An entire side of the garage had collapsed, and the carefully mowed yard was now covered with debris. D'Elia pushed through the crowd, and then he saw what everybody was staring at. There was a woman's body lying on the front porch. She had wavy gray hair, but her face was obscured by burns and soot, and her left arm had been blown off, and her abdomen had been ripped open. D'Elia didn't know this woman, but seeing her shattered body and destroyed home made him feel furious. Bombings were rare in Salt Lake City, and back-to-back bombings were basically unheard of. So D'Elia was quite certain that the same killer or killers were responsible for both. D'Elia approached one of the deputies who was already on scene and asked what they knew so far. The deputy told him that the victim's name was Kathleen Sheets. She was a 50-year-old schoolteacher and mother, and she was married to a financial consultant named Gary Sheets. Gary was the founder of that failed investment company where Steve Christensen used to work, and the men had a close professional relationship until about 2 months ago when their business went under. Then, the deputy showed D'Elia a piece of cardboard from the box that the bomb came in. There, in black marker on the cardboard, was Gary's name. Apparently, the deputy said, Gary was the bomb's intended target, not his wife. D'Elia thought this over. Two partners whose business recently failed had both been targeted by devastating bombs within hours of each other. D'Elia wondered if someone who had lost money when Steve and Gary's company collapsed might be out for revenge. But D'Elia also thought it was possible that maybe Gary killed his former business partner and his wife and only wrote his name on the box as a diversion. Either way, D'Elia knew exactly who investigators needed to speak to next. Later that morning, Detective Farnsworth sat in an interview room at the Salt Lake City police station across from Gary Sheets. Gary was in his 50s with white hair and even whiter teeth, but his eyes were red from crying. Farnsworth tried to be gentle while asking questions, and Gary was very forthcoming despite his obvious shock and grief. He explained that he and Steve used to run a financial consulting company together, working with wealthy investors. They'd done well until some bad investments left the company on the verge of bankruptcy. Then, 2 months ago, Steve had decided to leave and start his own consulting company with a new partner, leaving Gary to try to deal with the mess of their failed business. But Gary said he didn't have any animosity towards Steve, and he was heartbroken to hear about Steve's violent death. As for his own wife's murder, Gary said he couldn't believe any of this was real. Detective Farnsworth felt sorry for the guy and knew Gary should be with his family right now, but there was a bomber who was loose in Salt Lake City, and his questions just couldn't wait. He asked if Gary knew anyone who might want to hurt him. Gary paused for a moment and then said, well, yeah. When his and Steve's company failed, a lot of investors lost a lot of money. Maybe these bombs were a spurned investor's way of getting revenge. But if this was the case, Gary wondered, why target his wife? Detective Farnsworth swallowed hard and told Gary the bomb had actually been inside a cardboard box and his name had been written on the box. As far as police could tell, someone out there had actually wanted Gary dead, not his wife. Hearing this news, Gary began to cry, not only at the thought of his wife being murdered by mistake, but also because the reality that somebody was out to kill him was terrifying, and he began shaking like he was just so scared he couldn't help it. And so seeing this, Farnsworth immediately offered to place him in protective custody until the police solved the case. In the meantime, they needed Gary to put together a list of all the investors who'd lost money when his and Steve's company dissolved. Any one of them could be the bomber. While Detective Farnsworth wrapped up his conversation with Gary, his partner, Detective Bell, was a few miles away on the couch in Steve Christensen's living room. Steve's very pregnant wife, Terry, sat across from him looking totally numb. A few members of the family had come over as soon as they heard the news, and they took care of Steve and Terry's boys while she spoke with the detective. Her voice was flat as she told Detective Bell that she didn't know how she was going to live without her husband. Beyond the shock and grief of losing someone she loved so much, Terry was now going to have to find a way to support 4 children on her own, and the family's financial situation was not good. She sighed and sort of muttered under her breath that she wished Steve hadn't been so generous with the church. Detective Bell asked what she meant. Terry tucked a strand of her short blonde hair behind her ear and explained that Steve was always spending money on Mormon artifacts. The previous year, in 1984, he'd paid $40,000 for one document and then just handed it over to the church. Detective Bell looked confused. Terry explained that this document, called the Salamander Letter, was valuable because it was so controversial, raising doubts about the founding of the Mormon Church. The church taught that the founder of Mormonism was led to the Book of Mormon by an angel, but the letter said he'd actually been led there by a white salamander. Terry said that Steve's friend, Mark Hoffman, had found the Salamander Letter from one of his confidential sources, and when word got out that Mark had the letter, church leaders got really upset because it totally went against their teachings. Terry said she didn't want Steve to buy this letter, but he did it anyway. And then he donated the document to the Mormon Church. And just like that, Steve and Terry's family had lost $40,000, money that they really needed right now. Detective Bell could see how upsetting this was for Terry. He didn't want to cause her any more grief, so he thanked her for the information and told her how sorry he was for her loss. But before he got up to leave, Terry stopped him. She said she felt like the Salamander Letter might have something to do with her husband's murder. The letter's discovery caused some Mormons to leave the church, and they might have blamed Steve for shattering their faith. Detective Bell wasn't sure what to think, but he promised Terry he would look into it. The next day, at about 2:40 p.m., Detective Farnsworth cruised down the highway towards the police station. It was only the second day of the investigation, but Farnsworth already felt enormous pressure to solve this case. People were scared, especially after a local reporter had received an anonymous call claiming there were 4 more bombs already planted all around Salt Lake City. And at a press conference the night before, the Salt Lake City police chief had said the crime could be related to this Salamander Letter. And so fearing that their affiliation with the Mormon Church could make them the next victims, multiple prominent Mormons had taken their wives and kids into hiding. Detective Farnsworth pulled into the police station, but just as he turned off the ignition, he heard an emergency report on the police radio. The dispatcher said all available police needed to head to an address near Main Street in downtown Salt Lake City. Just as the public feared, the bomber had struck a third time. Minutes later, Detective Farnsworth skidded to a stop near a blue Toyota sports car that was still smoldering. A firefighter sprayed water onto the smoking vehicle, and Farnsworth could hear the siren of an approaching ambulance just a few blocks away. Farnsworth jumped out of his car and saw that the entire driver's side of the blue Toyota had been blown apart, and a few feet away, a Salt Lake City police officer was kneeling on the ground, cradling an injured man's head. The man looked like a total wreck to Farnsworth. There were shards of glass in his face, his bloody right hand was missing a fingertip, and he had a piece of metal shrapnel sticking out of his right knee. But somehow, this man was alive. Just then, the sirens reached a fever pitch as the ambulance arrived on the scene. 2 EMTs jumped out of the vehicle and ran over to the injured man and began taking his vitals. Detective Farnsworth leaned down and asked the injured man for his name. In between labored breaths, he said his name was Mark Hoffman. Farnsworth immediately recognized that name. Mark was the man who had discovered the controversial Salamander Letter and sold it to Steve. But before the detective could ask any follow-up questions, the EMTs loaded Mark into the back of the ambulance and sped off to the hospital. Moments later, Prosecutor D'Elia and a federal agent who specialized in bombing cases arrived on the scene. The federal agent immediately began examining Mark's smoldering vehicle, while Farnsworth got D'Elia up to speed about the latest victim. But just then, the federal agent called out to them to come over and look at what he'd found inside of Mark's trunk. Farnsworth and D'Elia ran to the back of the sports car, and in the trunk they saw a trove of old-looking papers that had been damaged in the explosion. They were either burnt from the fire or sopping wet from when the firefighter had doused the vehicle with water, but they were all there and clearly seemed pretty important. As he looked at the ruined papers, Detective Farnsworth was overwhelmed with questions. Why would someone want to kill Mark Hoffman? Could it be related to the documents inside his trunk? Or could it be someone who blamed Mark and Steve for unearthing the salamander letter that undermined the Mormon faith? And if that was the case, why would the bomber then also target Gary and Kathy Sheets? They were connected to Steve, but they had nothing to do with the buying and selling of Mormon artifacts, and so none of it made any sense. At about 4 p.m. that afternoon, Detective Bell stood in Mark Hoffman's room at the LDS Church Hospital. Mark had all these open wounds on his face from where doctors had pulled glass out, and he was waiting for an operation on his injured leg. Bell felt terrible for him, but on the bright side, doctors said he was likely going to live. Mark was on pain medication, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Detective Bell asked him if he felt well enough to talk, and Mark croaked out a yes. The detective asked Mark where he was going when the explosion happened, and Mark said he was on his way to sell some rare documents to a lawyer downtown. Bell asked what kind of documents, and Mark sort of paused for a minute and then said he couldn't actually remember. He said he couldn't actually recall much of anything from that morning except opening his car door and seeing a small package fall out. Mark said he went to pick up the package, and then everything went black. Detective Bell nodded grimly. He'd heard from people in the Mormon community that Mark was this incredibly talented and charismatic man. Mark was jokingly known as the Mormon Indiana Jones because he was so good at finding valuable artifacts. So to Bell, even though he didn't know Mark, it just seemed so sad that this guy was kind of a shell of himself with virtually no memory of what nearly killed him. Bell asked Mark if he could recall anything from before the explosion. Mark thought for a moment, and then he whispered that he had noticed a brown pickup truck that seemed like it was following him right before the explosion. The truck didn't worry him at the time, but only now, as he thought about it, he wondered if the bomber might have been trailing him. He'd seen through the mirror that the driver was a white man with brown hair, but besides that, Mark didn't get a good look at the guy because, again, it didn't really matter to him at the time. Detective Bell nodded. It sounded like the driver could be the same person the father and son saw in the Judge building. But still, there was a lot of white men with brown hair in Salt Lake City, Utah, so this was not a particularly helpful clue. Just then, a doctor came into the room and said they needed to begin prepping Mark for his leg surgery. Detective Bell thanked Mark for the information and then turned to leave. Two days later, on Friday, October 18th, Bell and Farnsworth sat inside of an interview room facing a man named Shannon Flynn. The detectives had learned that Shannon was Mark Hoffman's full-time employee, helping him find and sell these rare documents. And so if anybody could help investigators understand what was going on in this strange and secretive world of trading Mormon artifacts, it was Shannon. Sitting at the table, Shannon seemed very nervous. But then again, so far 3 bombs had gone off in Salt Lake City, targeting Shannon's boss and another man he routinely worked with, Steve. Shannon admitted that he was terrified of becoming the bomber's next victim. Detective Bell asked Shannon if there was any particular person he felt afraid of, but Shannon shook his head and said no. He told them that a lot of these document sales happened anonymously through people's lawyers or other representatives, so this made the whole situation even more frightening. Somebody could have it out for him, and he wouldn't even know their name. Bell asked if Shannon knew anybody who might want to hurt his boss, Mark, and Shannon said that Mark was having financial trouble related to 2 different document sales. Either one could have made Mark some enemies. Shannon said for the first deal, Mark had asked his friend Steve Christensen for help getting a private $185,000 loan to purchase a collection of antique documents. And now, Mark was having trouble paying back that loan, which had very much upset Steve. But Mark kept telling Steve not to worry because he had an even bigger sale pending. And when that went through, Mark promised he could pay back the loan then. But Shannon said Mark's second document sale had also hit a snag. Mark had acquired the only known copy of the first document ever printed in colonial America, known as the Oath of a Freeman, a discovery so significant that the United States Library of Congress had offered to buy it for $1 million. But the Library of Congress wanted elaborate proof that this document was indeed authentic before they paid such a huge amount for it. And so this delay in the sale was really putting Mark in a very serious cash crunch. Detective Bell asked Shannon if he knew where Mark got the document, but Shannon said no, Mark didn't share the names of his contacts very often. At this point, the detective was starting to feel suspicious of Shannon. It was hard to believe that as Mark's only full-time employee, he didn't know anything about where these documents were coming from. Plus, Detective Bell didn't understand why Mark would have needed a loan to buy artifacts. He knew Mark had made hundreds of thousands of dollars selling antiques, so Detective Bell outright asked Shannon if he knew where all of his money had gone. Shannon suddenly looked down at the table and sort of mumbled that Mark lived far beyond his means. He traveled all the time, lived in a huge house, and drove an expensive sports car. Plus, Mark could be generous almost to a fault. Shannon said that one time Mark had given him money to buy a submachine gun for his firearm collection, and then he also helped pay to convert that submachine gun into a fully automatic gun. When Detective Bell heard this, he tried to keep his expression neutral, but he was shocked. Shannon had just confessed to turning a gun into a fully automatic weapon, which was illegal. Detective Bell glanced at Farnsworth, and he looked just as surprised. Bell quietly asked Farnsworth to step into the hall with him. Once they were out there and out of earshot of Shannon, they both agreed that Shannon seemed very suspicious, and because he confessed to owning an illegal firearm, they had probable cause to arrest him and search his home. So that's exactly what the detectives did. Shannon was immediately taken into custody on the firearms charge, and when Bell and Farnsworth searched his home, they found at least 3 more guns. Then they stumbled on something even more shocking. Shannon owned a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook, a notorious 1970s book that contained instructions for building bombs. Just like that, Shannon shot to the top of their suspects list, and they quickly got another warrant to search more of Shannon's property. It turned out Shannon rented a storage unit, and police suspected that might be where he was constructing bombs. That weekend, Detective Bell arrived at what investigators called the War Room, a big conference room in the Salt Lake City police station where everyone working the case could meet and discuss their progress. Bell sat down with Farnsworth, Prosecutor D'Elia, and the federal agent from the third bombing scene, as well as a number of other law enforcement officials. And they had a lot to talk about. Even though the search of Shannon Flynn's storage unit hadn't revealed anything incriminating, he still seemed extremely suspicious. If the police were right, and these bombings were all related to the rare document trade, then Shannon seemed like their only real suspect. But Detective Bell knew that this explanation did not account for the murder of Kathy Sheets. As far as police could tell, Kathy and Gary Sheets had not been involved in buying or selling Mormon documents and had nothing to do with Shannon Flynn. So, Prosecutor D'Elia suggested the investigators go back through the dozens of interviews they'd conducted. Maybe if they reviewed all of the evidence as a group, something would stand out. And so Bell and Farnsworth just began reading their notes out loud, going through every last detail from each person they'd spoken to, and as they did this, suddenly, the federal agent's hand shot up, and he told them to stop. The agent said he just noticed something. A detail from one of the interviews didn't make sense. One of their witnesses had to be lying, and he felt certain this person who was lying was the bomber. Immediately, investigators started drafting a court motion to get one more search warrant. And during the search, just a few days later, they uncovered a piece of evidence that broke the case wide open and led to a shocking revelation that nobody imagined. Based on the evidence found during police searches, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened during the Salt Lake City bombings of 1985. Late on the night of October 14th, the killer stood at a work table in their basement, putting the finishing touches on 2 homemade bombs. They'd spent the last few weeks researching how to build them, and they felt confident the design would work. The killer taped dozens of long carpenter's nails over one bomb and added extra explosive powder to the second, making both bombs extra lethal. Then they gently placed each bomb into separate cardboard boxes. The killer had already used an ice pick to carve 2 small holes into the bottom of both boxes. Now they carefully threaded the wires from the motion sensor switches in each bomb through these holes. They taped the wires to the outside of the box to keep them separated, and when the time was right, they would connect the wires, activating the motion sensor switch inside that would make the bombs detonate. Satisfied, the killer turned the cardboard boxes back over and taped them closed. They then grabbed a black felt-tip marker and wrote on the first box, "To Steve Christensen," and on the second box they wrote, "To Gary Sheets." Finally, the killer padded upstairs and got into bed, satisfied that everything was ready. The next morning, the bomber woke up before sunrise. They slipped out of bed, tiptoed to the basement, and carried each box outside to the car. It was chilly, so they ran back in and put on their old green Letterman jacket. Then they got into the car and drove downtown to Salt Lake City. At about 6:45 a.m., the killer parked outside the Judge building, got out of their car, and lifted the box labeled "To Steve Christensen" out of the back seat. They hoped to slip in and out of the building without being seen, but the moment they walked into the lobby, they ran into two people, a father and son. The bomber pretended to be a delivery driver and got into the elevator with these two men. These men got out on the third floor, and when the killer reached the sixth-floor hallway, they found their way to the office door that had Steve Christensen and Randy Rigby's names written on it. There, the killer knelt down, turned the box over, and carefully connected the two wires on the bottom, activating the motion sensor switch inside the bomb. Then they very carefully set the box right side up. Then they casually turned, walked to the stairwell, headed downstairs, outside to their car, and drove away from the Judge building. About 15 minutes later, the bomber arrived outside of a big brick home in the suburban city of Holiday. They didn't see any cars parked outside, so they assumed the home's owner, Gary Sheets, had left and would be home later that afternoon. The bomber walked up to the front door carrying the cardboard box. Then they taped the motion sensor wires together and gently placed the bomb near Gary's front porch. After that, the killer turned, walked back to their car, and drove home. When they got there, they opened up the front door, and the house was quiet. So they slipped back into bed without being noticed by anybody else inside. But once the bomber got out of bed, they couldn't resist the urge to turn on the morning news. And at about 8:30 a.m., while they were sipping coffee on the couch, the news broke. A bomb had gone off at the Judge building, and a man had been killed. The killer pretended to be just as shocked as anybody else in the house was. They even called into work and canceled meetings that day so they could stay home to be safe. Then, less than 2 hours later, local news stations reported the second bombing. But as the killer watched the coverage of this second bombing, they realized their plan had not gone as smoothly as they'd thought. They'd meant to kill Gary Sheets, but the news report said the second victim was a woman. And things got even worse that evening when the Salt Lake City police chief gave a press conference. The killer watched as the police chief said the bombings might be related to a controversial Mormon document called the Salamander Letter. The killer's stomach sank. They couldn't believe the police had zeroed in on the real reason for the bombings so quickly. They had to find some way to get investigators off the trail. And the only way they could think to do that was to create even more chaos. So, late that night, the killer crept down to the basement and constructed a third bomb. The next afternoon, on October 16th, the killer put the bomb in the passenger seat of their car and drove to a busy area downtown. They parked, got out, and then leaned back into the car to turn the bomb over in the passenger seat. They attached the two wires on the bottom of the box, activating the motion sensor switch inside. Then, as they went to take the box out of the car, they jostled it just a bit too hard, and the bomb detonated, sending the killer flying. They crashed into the pavement with shrapnel stuck in their legs and face. They were missing a fingertip, and they were barely breathing. At about 4 p.m. on Wednesday, October 16th, when Detective Bell went to the hospital to interview Mark, he had a lot of questions about how the explosion happened. Mark said he opened his car door and a small package had fallen out, then exploded. But later, when Detective Bell read his notes from this interview aloud to fellow investigators, the federal agent said Mark's story did not line up with the physical evidence. The pattern of damage inside of Mark's car showed the bomb was somewhere near the center console when it detonated, not anywhere close to the driver's side floorboard like Mark had claimed. Now they had caught Mark in what looked like a lie. It was enough for the police to get a warrant to search his home, and there, shoved in the back of a closet, they found a green Letterman jacket, just like the one the bomber wore. But that was far from the most damning evidence. Police also discovered 2 locked rooms in Mark's home, which his wife never entered. The rooms were filled with stacks of old-looking papers, inks, and chemicals. Detectives didn't know what to make of all this until they found a receipt from a local engraving company. The owner of the company told them that Mark had ordered a special engraving plate that would allow him to recreate a famous historical document called the Oath of a Freeman. The same document Mark was trying to sell as authentic to the Library of Congress for $1 million. The detectives soon put 2 and 2 together. Mark Hoffman did not have secret sources who provided him with rare and valuable artifacts. Instead, he'd been forging documents the entire time, which was why he wouldn't tell his employee, Shannon Flynn, where he was getting them from. As for why Mark did all this, money was his most obvious motive. He'd made hundreds of thousands of dollars by forging documents, but he also had another aim. He wanted to embarrass the Mormon church he'd grown up in. Although Mark pretended to be a devout Mormon, he'd stopped believing in the church's doctrines when he was a teenager. As an adult, he started forging papers that would undermine the church's history and shake other people's faith too. The salamander letter was totally fake, but it did embarrass church leaders by making it look like Mormonism was inspired by a salamander rather than an angel. And Mark's friend, Steve, had paid him $40,000 for it, believing it was real. Then, in the months leading up to the bombings, Mark had persuaded Steve to arrange a big $185,000 loan to buy a collection of Mormon letters that did not even exist. Mark took the money from Steve and squandered it on fancy vacations and a sports car, and then couldn't repay the loan. So, to get out of this financial hole, Mark forged a copy of the historic Oath of a Freeman that he planned to sell to the Library of Congress for $1 million. But after Mark gave this fake document to library officials to verify, weeks ticked by with no word from them, and he got nervous that experts had found a flaw in his forgery and his whole scheme would fall apart. And at the same time, Mark's friend, Steve, was getting very impatient with Mark for not repaying his $185,000 overdue loan. And so at this point, Mark decided his only option was violence. He murdered Steve to get him off of his back, and then planted a bomb at Gary Sheets' house as a diversion. In reality, Mark didn't care whether Gary lived or died. He just wanted police to think that the bombings were all related to Steve and Gary's failed financial consulting business. And the plan almost worked until Mark made the mistake of setting off a bomb in his own car. He later claimed he did this on purpose in an attempt to commit suicide, but investigators believed Mark actually intended to use this bomb either to kill Shannon Flynn, who was talking to police about Mark's financial problems, or to cause such a scene in downtown Salt Lake City that it would throw the detectives off his trail. Officers arrested Mark Hoffman in January of 1986, and he quickly confessed to both the forgeries and the bombings, but he expressed no remorse for what he'd done. Mark then pleaded guilty in exchange for a life sentence rather than facing the death penalty. Once he was in prison, Mark's wife divorced him, and he was excommunicated from the Mormon Church. Mark later attempted suicide, but he would survive. However, he would permanently damage his right arm, ironically losing control of the hand he'd once used to commit his many forgeries. In May of 2009, someone in Guatemala uploaded an 18-minute-long video to YouTube titled YouTube Murder. Within hours of it being published, the video went massively viral to the point where YouTube's servers began to crash. And in Guatemala, angry crowds of people demanding justice began forming in the streets. When the president of Guatemala reluctantly authorized an investigation into what this video actually meant, no one was ready for the insane truth it revealed. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to tint the 5-star review button's car windows free of charge, and then when they say yes, spray paint all of their windows black. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In May of 2009, 48-year-old Rodrigo Rosenberg was at the peak of his career as one of Guatemala's most prominent lawyers. Tall, handsome, and charismatic, Rodrigo had law degrees from both Cambridge University and Harvard University, and he was the co-founder of a very successful corporate law office in Guatemala City, the country's capital. And while it was obvious that Rodrigo had worked very hard for all of the nice things he had, like his luxury Mercedes-Benz car, in reality, he didn't really have to work for a living. Rodrigo had been born into privilege. There was wealth on both sides of his family. His mother had brought a large inheritance to her marriage, and his father had built a massive business empire that included a chain of movie cinemas. When Rodrigo stepped out of his office building in downtown Guatemala City to meet a client for lunch at one of the upscale restaurants tucked away in the capital's maze of boutiques and little markets, he looked exactly like what he was, a member, like his parents before him, of the Guatemalan oligarchy, a small group of rich upper-class conservative Guatemalans who had connections and influence in government and business. He always wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, an immaculate white shirt, and a pale blue tie, an expensive uniform that set off his dark features and the ring of black hair cut short around the crown of his bald head. And when Rodrigo talked to his client in one of those hacienda-style eateries with red clay-tiled roofs and cool stucco interiors that he especially favored, it wouldn't be long before his client, like all of Rodrigo's clients, realized that it wasn't just the money or influence that drove Rodrigo. Like his friends and associates like to say, Rodrigo had a strong sense of purpose as well as ambition, and a very strong sense of right and wrong. He had chosen a career in law because he liked the clarity of the law. If it was practiced fairly, he felt like it was the best way of settling disagreements and disputes. But the thing that really made Rodrigo stand out in this Central American country of 16 million people was not just his brilliance and his drive, it was the fact that he had a reputation for absolute honesty. Because Guatemala was a country best known in the world for its incredible levels of corruption and violence. Even though 36 years of civil war between authoritarian rulers and leftist guerrillas had ended back in 1994, that conflict had left more than 200,000 people, many of them civilians, dead, and another 45,000 people, quote, disappeared, which meant either killed or kidnapped, mostly the work of government forces or right-wing paramilitary groups. But after the 1994 peace agreement was signed, most of the people in Guatemala who had committed the murders and rapes and other widespread human rights violations that took place during the Civil War were never prosecuted or called to account for their crimes. Instead, in the post-Civil War Guatemala, these should-be war criminals simply turned to new careers, such as participating in organized crime, becoming assassins for hire, or getting in on the very lucrative Central and South American drug trade. And 15 years later, even though Guatemala had a democratically elected civilian president who had promised to root out crime and government corruption, these criminals and their criminal networks had still been able to reach their tentacles into almost every government and law enforcement agency, and nearly half the country wasn't under any government control at all. By 2009, Guatemala had the third highest murder rate of any country in the world, averaging more than 123 homicides every week, and 97% of those murders went unsolved. And the few cases that did go to trial often ended with the alleged killers going free after judges or prosecutors or witnesses were bribed, threatened, or even murdered. So in this sea of corruption, where everyone with power seemed to have dirt on their hands, Rodrigo stood out for his willingness to shamelessly call out criminal behavior wherever he saw it. So to anyone who knew Rodrigo, it didn't come as any surprise when he wasn't just horrified when one of his very own clients was assassinated in broad daylight. He was absolutely furious, especially since this particular client, Musa Khalil, had a reputation for being a very ethical businessman who treated his workers fairly. Since arriving in Guatemala from Lebanon when he was just a young man, 76-year-old Musa had worked his way up from poverty to become a successful coffee producer and textile manufacturer. Although Rodrigo was not personally close to Musa, Rodrigo admired and respected the older man because the man refused to steal from the state or make payoffs to get favorable deals on his coffee or manufacturing companies. Musa was a straight shooter, just like Rodrigo. The assassination took place in Guatemala City on April 14, 2009, as Musa and his 37-year-old daughter Marjorie were waiting in their car at a traffic light while on their way to lunch. According to eyewitnesses, a car pulled up quickly behind them and a man hopped out and approached the front passenger seat of the Khalil's car where Musa was sitting. Musa and his daughter likely assumed that this man just wanted to ask them a question, but as soon as this man reached their car window, he pulled out a 9mm pistol and he fired 9 shots into Musa's head and torso. By the time the police arrived, the gunman had fled the scene on the back of a motorcycle driven by an accomplice, and Musa, along with his daughter, were both dead. It would turn out one of those 9 bullets that were fired at Musa had passed right through his body and struck and killed his daughter. She was not the intended target, she was just collateral damage. On the day of the murders, right after Rodrigo had found out about them, he contacted his 24-year-old son, Eduardo, who was also a lawyer at Rodrigo's law firm, and told him to meet him at the crime scene. When Eduardo arrived, he found his father pacing back and forth in front of the yellow crime scene tape, demanding answers from the police who had converged on the scene along with medical personnel. Turning to his approaching son, Rodrigo swept his arms out to either side in a gesture of helplessness and frustration that took in the whole chaotic scene in front of them. There was also an expression of shock and sadness on his father's face that Eduardo didn't see very often. You couldn't live in Guatemala without feeling like violence, even murder, was just business as usual. But Eduardo also understood that there was something different about this crime, something that made it stand out, especially to members of the city's wealthy upper class. Because, like them, Musa and his whole family were people with power and influence. They had personal ties with people inside the administration of Guatemala's president, Alvaro Colom. If Musa could be gunned down in cold blood in the middle of the day, others among the Guatemalan elite worried that the same thing could happen to them too. Before leaving the crime scene, Rodrigo told his son in a bitter voice that the police, like always, would probably never find and prosecute the people who killed Musa and Marjorie. And even if they did, they'd never be able to touch whoever it was that had organized the assassination in the first place. It didn't take long for Rodrigo's prediction to come true. Even though thousands of people turned out for the funeral service of Musa and his daughter, including President Colom's powerful private secretary, police made absolutely no progress on tracking down the killers, and it wasn't long before the murders just seemed like all the others in Guatemala, just numbers on a stat sheet. Except this time, Rodrigo had had enough. Musa had been a good man, and his innocent daughter, Marjorie, had left behind a husband and 2 children. And so if the police were not going to catch their killers, then Rodrigo would. Rodrigo told his son that one way or another, he was going to get to the bottom of this and figure out exactly who did it and why. But almost as soon as he got started asking questions, Rodrigo noticed that even by Guatemalan standards, the police seemed to have gathered virtually no information outside of taking the obligatory statements from witnesses who saw the assassination and asking Musa's family if he had had any business or money troubles. And as Rodrigo began calling some of his contacts within the government about the police investigation, he began to wonder whether there was an active attempt going on inside President Colom's circle of advisors to cover up some connection that the government itself might have to the assassination. So just a few days after Musa's funeral, Rodrigo turned to another one of his clients, a man named Luis Mendizabal, who was also a close friend of Rodrigo's. After calling Luis to arrange a visit, Rodrigo slipped out of his law office and drove to the exclusive men's clothing store that Luis owned in one of the capital's most fashionable districts. But the fitting and sale of handmade suits was just part of the business that Luis operated out of that storefront. To those who knew him well, they knew that Luis's real skill was in the collection of secrets and information. With his flowing white hair and trim mustache and his easy banter about his family and his grandchildren, Luis did not look the part of a spy. But as he measured and cut fabric and chatted with a wealthy clientele that included criminals, businessmen, military, police, and government bureaucrats, Luis gathered huge amounts of insider intel on what was going on in their country. And so if there was anyone who could help Rodrigo find out who killed Musa and Marjorie, it was Luis. Rodrigo's hunch paid off. Before long, Luis had come up with a possible lead in the Musa murder case. A few months before the assassination, at the very beginning of 2009, Musa had been nominated to serve on the board of directors for two institutions that both had ties to something called the Rural Development Bank, or the Ban Rural. The Ban Rural was the major funding source for the president's popular social programs, and these two institutions that had invited Musa to join them were engaged in a power struggle over which one of them would control the bank. But since rumors of sketchy financial dealings were already swirling around Ban Rural, when Musa was offered these two board positions, Rodrigo had actually advised him not to accept either of them. However, Rodrigo had no idea what Musa's final decision had been. Luis suspected that Musa, as he began to do his own research on these two institutions, had uncovered that one or both of them were engaged in financial mismanagement. More conversations with Musa's family seemed to confirm this theory. One of Musa's surviving daughters told Rodrigo that her father had received threatening letters from officials on the two boards, and that Musa had apparently written back to them saying, "You can't tell me what to do, and I will protect myself from my enemies." During the 3 weeks that followed Musa's assassination, Eduardo saw less and less of his father, who was spending more and more of his time on his own private investigation into these murders. It seemed to everyone who knew Rodrigo that his outrage over the murders had turned into an unhealthy obsession. Rodrigo basically stopped going in to the law office or returning calls to his regular clients, and instead just stayed home in his apartment where he lived alone to pore over his notes on the murders. And when Eduardo did meet his father for lunch or for dinner, Rodrigo barely touched his food, and all he wanted to talk about was his theory that Musa had somehow become the target of a conspiracy at the highest levels of government. His father, who had been an avid cyclist, had completely stopped going on his morning bike rides. He'd lost weight, his perfectly tailored suits hung on him just loosely enough that he looked disheveled, and his eyes never stopped moving, constantly checking his phone for calls and messages, and showing no interest at all about how things were going back at the office. Eduardo knew that both his parents were still struggling after having separated the year before. Rodrigo's own father had abandoned his family when Rodrigo was very young, and Rodrigo had never forgiven him, even refusing to accept the inheritance his father had left for him. So after Rodrigo's separation, when his estranged wife moved to neighboring Mexico with their 4 children, Rodrigo was crushed. He felt like he had abandoned his own family. Looking at his father now, Eduardo worried that any progress his father might have made in adjusting to his new situation and moving on with his personal life was now being completely consumed by this private murder investigation. It was obvious to Eduardo that this investigation had become more than just finding the killers. It was about trying to actually stop corruption at the heart of Guatemala's politics. And in early May of that year, Rodrigo suddenly knew, without a doubt, that all that digging and all the documents he was putting together about corruption at Ban Rural, all the names and dates of meetings, the involvement of President Colom and his wife, all of it was finally getting him closer to the people who had murdered his client. For weeks, he'd had the feeling that he was being followed, that everywhere he went outside of his apartment, someone was watching him. But now he had proof. Because now Rodrigo, like Musa, had started receiving threats. Except his threats were phone calls, not letters. The first call came on May 5th. It only lasted long enough for the caller to tell Rodrigo to stop his investigation into the murders. After that, the calls came once a day with the same message. And even though Rodrigo couldn't recognize the deliberately distorted voice on the other end of the line, he started to suspect that the threats were coming directly from within President Colom's inner circle, from Colom's private secretary himself, a man named Gustavo Alejos, who actually had an office directly across from the apartment where Rodrigo lived. Not only was Gustavo an influential advisor to the president, his brother was the head of the Guatemalan Congress. After these threatening calls started coming in, Rodrigo, who was far more excited at this development than afraid, called his spy friend Luis to tell him about how he thought Gustavo Alejos was the caller. Rodrigo also asked Luis to write down the unknown telephone number that belonged to this threatening caller. Even though he didn't say it explicitly, it was clear to Luis that he was being told to take this number down in case something happened to Rodrigo. After the two friends hung up, Luis felt very concerned. He felt like Rodrigo was aware of the danger he was in, but wasn't fully appreciating it. And so on May 8th, after Rodrigo met Luis at his clothing shop, Luis quickly pulled his friend into a back room, and once the door was shut and they were alone, Luis told Rodrigo in a hushed tone that not only should he stop his investigation into the murders, but that he should flee Guatemala altogether. Clearly, his life was in danger given the threatening phone calls he was getting, but Rodrigo said he could not stop now. He knew he was close to getting the name of Musa's killer and solid proof that the government had been involved in the assassination. He also told Luis, as a way of reassuring him, that once he had all the evidence he needed, he was not about to go to the Guatemalan police, who very well could have even played a role in the murders. Instead, he planned to present his findings to the powerful and high-profile International Criminal Court that is seated in The Hague in the Netherlands. The ICC is known around the world for trying cases that involve genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression, and for trying criminals like the ones in Guatemala who all received immunity from the Guatemalan government at the end of the Guatemalan Civil War. By going directly to The Hague, Rodrigo would finally be taking action against a system of government corruption that had, in the words of one of his friends, been eating at his guts for years. However, before he could go any further with this case, Rodrigo told Luis, as they sat in the back of Luis's shop, that there was one very specific thing that Rodrigo still had to do. And in order to do it, he needed Luis's help. It was a favor. And it was an insurance policy that no matter what happened in any court of law, the information that Rodrigo had uncovered was guaranteed to become public knowledge. Reluctantly, Luis agreed, and after discussing the details, they arranged to meet again the next day. As Rodrigo left the store, Luis had a bad feeling. He was certain that whatever the outcome of Rodrigo's plan, it was sure to bring a lot of pain to his family and to his friends. 2 days later, on Sunday, May 10th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Rodrigo stepped into one of the bedrooms of his trendy luxury apartment in the Zona 1 neighborhood of Guatemala City. Glancing out the window, he could see the faint outlines of the mountains that ringed the capital. But his mind was on other things. Luis had been as good as his word and had helped Rodrigo put together the final pieces of the case that he had been building one fact at a time against the Guatemalan government. His bodyguard, who also served as his driver, had also been willing to help, running a couple of errands the week before that Rodrigo had not been able to see to himself, including taking Rodrigo's bike in for a tune-up. It had been more than a month since Rodrigo had done any serious cycling, but the night before, he'd made up his mind that this morning he was going to go out and go for a ride, even if it was just a short one. He was lucky with the day's weather. May was one of Guatemala's rainiest months, but that morning was dry and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Rodrigo pulled on his navy blue bike shorts and blue short-sleeved top and laced up his white sneakers. Leaving his bedroom, he checked the gold watch on his left wrist and then walked toward the front door, pausing long enough to grab the red and white mountain bike that was leaning against the wall in the front hallway. He wheeled his bike to the elevator, and a minute later, he was pushing the bike out of the apartment complex onto the sidewalk that led to the main street that ran left to right in front of the building. Once Rodrigo made it to the edge of this main road, he looked both ways along the road to see if any cars were coming, and as he did that, the sun broke through and suddenly lit up the grass and trees along either side of the street. Just before getting on his bike, Rodrigo checked to make sure his iPod was queued up to his favorite band, Santana. He hit play, and then he pushed his bike off the curb into the road, he turned right, then hopped on his bike, and began pedaling down the street. After only a few hundred yards, Rodrigo turned right again off of the main road onto a service road. The sun reflected off the windows of a brown and white high-rise apartment just ahead of him on the left. Minutes later, Rodrigo noticed a man running across the street in front of him from the left to the right, and at first, Rodrigo thought it was a jogger. But then he noticed this man was wearing jeans and a dark jacket with a high collar. The running man, after he crossed the street and was on the right side, he slowed and then looked intently at Rodrigo, and for a second, their eyes met. And then this man with the jeans and the jacket began running at full speed towards Rodrigo. Okay, back to the story. Before Rodrigo could do anything except make a final erratic swerve to the right that took his bike right to the edge of the curb, the man had closed the distance between them, reached into the waistband of his jeans, and pulled out a gun. Rodrigo felt the thud of the first 3 bullets and heard the loud crack of each shot. His bike clattered to the pavement as he fell backward over the curb until he was half laying in the grassy median. By the time the second 2 bullets shattered Rodrigo's jaw and forehead, Rodrigo was dead. A few seconds later, nearby residents heard the sound of a car gunning its engine and roaring off into the distance. Within minutes, those same residents of the Zona 1 neighborhood were on their phones, making frantic calls to 911 to report the sound of gunfire. Police were on the scene almost immediately. On his way to Rodrigo's apartment, Rodrigo's bodyguard heard the sirens and saw the police cars that were blocking the service road near his employer's apartment. He slowed down, and as police started setting up a perimeter, he thought he caught a glimpse of a red and white bike on the pavement. He parked his car at the top of the service road, and as he jumped out and headed towards the knot of police and emergency personnel, he pulled out his phone and called Rodrigo's son, Eduardo, because by now, the bodyguard could clearly see that the body sprawled on the edge of the service road near that red and white bike belonged to his employer. Rodrigo's bodyguard had known what Rodrigo was working on. He'd even run some errands that he'd suspected were related to the case his boss was investigating. He'd warned Rodrigo to be careful. He wished now that he had insisted on staying over last night and accompanying Rodrigo on this bike ride. A few minutes later, Eduardo, as well as his father's friend, Luis, showed up at the crime scene. Ashen-faced, Eduardo identified himself as Rodrigo's son, but before he and Luis had time to process what they were seeing, they were both approached by Guatemala police officers who were eager to start gathering information about what had happened. Right as the 2 men stepped back away from the carnage in front of them, Eduardo noticed his father was wearing a wedding ring on his finger again. And instantly when he saw that, Eduardo recalled a secret his father had told him right around the time Musa and Marjorie had been killed. And as he thought of this secret, Eduardo felt an unexpected rush of grief come over him, and his eyes started to fill with tears. He felt so sorry for his father, and he just hoped that the police would be able to find his killer and bring them to justice. But before the police could really even begin their investigation, something happened that would push the Guatemalan government to the edge of total collapse. On May 12th, 2 days after Rodrigo's murder, hundreds of people crowded into a church to attend Rodrigo's funeral service. The pews were filled wall to wall with his family, friends, clients, government officials, business leaders, and the fashionably dressed members of the capital's wealthy oligarchy. Right after Eduardo had delivered his father's eulogy, Rodrigo's friend, Luis, stepped forward and addressed the mourners, who looked like a who's who of the Guatemalan elite. Taking a deep breath, Luis said to the crowd that he knew they were all asking themselves the same question. Why would anyone want to kill Rodrigo Rosenberg? Then Luis held up his hand, showing the crowd a case that contained a DVD. This, he said, contained the answer to that question. Once the surprised and excited murmurs quieted down, Luis went on to say that Rodrigo had left instructions that if he was murdered, then Luis should go public with the 18-minute-long video that he now held in his hand. Luis, who said that he himself had only seen the video after his friend's death, invited anyone in the crowd interested to take a copy of the DVD with them when they left. One of the mourners who took Luis up on that offer was a government minister who immediately called President Colom's personal secretary, Gustavo Alejos, to tell him what had just happened. A few minutes later, the minister slipped out of the church and drove straight to the National Palace in the center of Guatemala City, where President Colom lived with his wife. As President Colom, along with his vice president and closest advisors, gathered in the president's office, an aide slipped the disc into the president's computer and then hit play. A second later, they were all staring at an image of Rodrigo sitting alone behind a table with a blue screen behind him. He was wearing his usual navy blue suit, pressed white shirt, light blue tie, and wedding ring. In front of him was a microphone. There was nothing professional or polished about the production of the video that filled the computer screen in front of the president and his aides. And for some reason, that made the message that Rodrigo delivered even more believable and chilling. After stating his name for the record, Rodrigo wasted no time dropping the bombshell that would soon be heard all over the world, as the 18-minute-long video was uploaded to YouTube, where it would go viral under the simple title, YouTube Murder. On the video, Rodrigo very calmly states, "If you are seeing or hearing this message, it means that I've been murdered by President Alvaro Colom with the help of his personal secretary, Gustavo Alejos." Rodrigo would also blame the president, his wife, and Gustavo Alejos for the assassination of Musa Khalil and his daughter. Rodrigo stated that they were killed because Musa's involvement with the Rural Development Bank, Ban Rural, had put him in a position to reveal the president and first lady's abuse and misappropriation of Ban Rural funds. Rodrigo said the president's motive for killing him, Rodrigo, was because Rodrigo had direct knowledge of the conspiracy to kill Musa, and that Rodrigo also had proof that the president and first lady were using Ban Rural to embezzle and launder millions of dollars. Rodrigo warned Guatemalans against believing the smear campaign and cover-ups that would greet these accusations, ending with a plea to all Guatemalans that it was time for massive government reform. And the first step was to get rid of President Colom and replace him with the vice president, who was not a thief or assassin, and whose duty it would be to bring the rule of law back to Guatemala. Rodrigo's video would have a massive ripple effect. Within hours of its upload to YouTube, Guatemala was plunged into a sudden and totally unexpected political crisis. The people of Guatemala, for the most part, believed what Rodrigo was saying. Even some of the president's own advisors wondered if the accusations were true. The president's initial reaction was not to respond to the accusations himself, but rather to send two of his aides out to publicly dismiss the video as a fake. However, this would have the opposite effect. And so that night, under lots of mounting pressure, President Colom went on national TV to deny the accusations himself. However, he looked more scared and nervous than convincing. Meanwhile, so many people from all over the world were watching this video that YouTube servers started to crash, and protesters wearing white shirts to symbolize their demand for a clean government started to flood the streets of Guatemala's capital city. Alvaro Colom knew before the end of that Tuesday, May 12th, that his presidency was hanging on by just a thread. So when protesters and the Guatemalan elite demanded that a United Nations-backed agency, rather than the Guatemalan police, handle the investigation into Rodrigo's death, the president knew he had to agree. By the next morning, May 13th, the whole investigation was in the hands of an international commission called the CICIG. This organization had been created by the United Nations in 2007 to investigate specific cases of systemic violence and corruption. And under the direction of Spanish Judge Carlos Castrosana, who took up residence in Guatemala City, an international group of investigators did what Guatemalan police either couldn't do or wouldn't do. They began relentlessly drilling down into who was behind the assassination of Rodrigo Rosenberg. The first break in the case happened almost immediately. Whoever had organized the hit on Rodrigo had chosen one of the most heavily videotaped neighborhoods in Guatemala. While investigators couldn't find a reliable eyewitness to the crime, footage gathered from dozens of security cameras near Rodrigo's apartment had captured almost the entire assassination on camera. Almost immediately after getting onto his bicycle at 8:05 a.m., Rodrigo was followed by a black late-model Mazda. Security cameras also caught clear enough images of that black getaway car that investigators were eventually able to track down the car and then its owner. And when they examined the car owner's phone records and location data, investigators were able to place him and several calls he made on the day of the murder at or near the crime scene. Investigators immediately set up a wiretap operation on the car owner, and for the next 4 months, they listened in on his conversations, and quickly, they discovered that he was part of a criminal gang made up of 10 men, most of them former national police officers. Meanwhile, using the CIG powers, Judge Castrosana started identifying and arresting corrupt members of the Guatemalan government. And as Rodrigo had predicted in his 18-minute video, investigators were up against a disinformation campaign organized by the president or his top advisors aimed at interfering with the investigation and smearing the vice president, the man Rodrigo had tapped as Colom's successor. But it wasn't until September, 4 months after Rodrigo was killed, that Judge Castrosana got the breakthrough he was looking for. After a massive raid on 10 different locations throughout Guatemala, investigators arrested all 10 members of the criminal gang whose phones investigators had been tapping. Once in custody, it didn't take long for members of this gang to start giving up information in exchange for lighter sentences. And so quickly, investigators were able to start to piece together how the murder was carried out, except they were missing a crucial piece of information. The 10-person gang clearly didn't know Rodrigo. They were just following orders to have him killed. But what the investigators couldn't figure out was who gave them that order. Who was the person behind the scenes making this assassination happen? Judge Castrosana and his team believed this person was an inside man, someone who had been close enough to Rodrigo, who had not ridden his bike in over a month, to know that Rodrigo had chosen that morning to go for a bike ride down that service road. But it wouldn't be until investigators tracked down a small piece of paper with a faded signature on it that the so-called inside man would be revealed. Based on all the information investigators found, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to Rodrigo Rosenberg. On Friday, May 1st, 16 days after the murder of Musa and his daughter Marjorie, and 9 days before Rodrigo's murder, the inside man, who would mastermind Rodrigo's assassination, contacted one of his most trusted lieutenants. He told him to go buy 2 prepaid mobile phones. He told the man to pay cash and warned him not to sign his name on any paperwork or sales receipt. The lieutenant did as he was told and dropped both phones along with the sales receipt off at the office of the inside man. By this point, the inside man had already arranged the hit on Rodrigo. He had reached out to 2 men who were actually close friends and relatives of Rodrigo, 2 powerful brothers who owned one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in Guatemala. The inside man had told them that he needed their help arranging a hit on a man he described as a, quote, extortionist. The brothers said they knew of a criminal gang that would probably do the hit for about $40,000. The 3 men settled the details. The brothers told the inside man that they would contact the hitmen and arrange the payment, along with the delivery of a burner phone that the hitmen would use to communicate with the inside man. The inside man set the murder date for Sunday, May 10th, and told the hitman that he would be in touch with them before that day with a detailed physical description of their target, along with information on where and when they should actually commit the murder. Then, starting on Monday, May 4th, the inside man used the second prepaid cell phone to start calling Rodrigo's personal cell phone. He called Rodrigo at least once a day for the next 5 days, speaking only long enough to make a single threat, telling the lawyer to stop investigating the assassination of Musa Khalil. On May 9th, 1 day before Rodrigo's murder, the inside man called the hitmen to tell them that Rodrigo would be on a bike and would be most vulnerable shortly after leaving his apartment when he turned onto a nearby service road. The next day, shortly before 8 a.m., the 2 hitmen sitting outside Rodrigo's apartment in the black Mazda with tinted windows heard their phone buzz. The driver took the call and turned on the speakerphone, and then they heard the sound of the inside man's voice. The shooter sat up and listened while he double-checked that his 9mm pistol was loaded. The voice on the phone was low and calm. Their target, he told them, was a tall, thin man dressed in navy shorts, a light blue top, and white sneakers. He would be leaving the apartment building at about 8:05 a.m. He'd be riding a red and white mountain bike. He told them to follow Rodrigo onto that service road and then ambush him there. He told them to approach Rodrigo from behind and shoot him in the back, and then once he was down, fire at least 4 more shots into Rodrigo's neck, up into his jaw, and a final shot into his forehead. The inside man told the hitmen to be sure they destroyed the cell phone he had given them, along with its SIM card, once the assassination was complete. The hitmen said they understood, and they hung up. At the same time, Rodrigo was standing in one of his bedrooms in his apartment looking out the window, and then a couple of seconds later, he turned around and went into the kitchen where he made sure his coffee maker was turned off. Then he collected his bike from the hallway. Pushing his bike next to him, he headed to the apartment elevator and punched the button for the ground floor where he exited the building. Once outside, Rodrigo made his way towards the main street, taking a few seconds to enjoy the cool temperatures and the sudden sunshine that was pouring through a break in the clouds. Then he queued up a song by Santana on his iPod, and despite feeling a little rusty and stiff, he hopped onto his bike, he turned right, and he began heading down the main street. After a few hundred yards, he turned onto the service road. When he saw the man in jeans and the dark jacket running towards him, he tensed up, but only for a second. Then he quickly turned his bike towards the side of the road where he jammed on his brakes, coming to a complete and sudden stop. Then he got off of his bike, dropping it onto the pavement in front of him, and then he sat down on the curb with his back to the man running toward him. A moment later, Rodrigo would have felt the first bullet hit him in the back. Before he could even absorb the punch or feel any pain, he felt the next 4 bullets hit. 1 in his cheek, 1 in his neck, 1 just below his jaw, and finally, with the killer standing right in front of him, another round into his forehead, knocking his upper body backward onto the grassy median. Seconds later, residents of the apartments in Zona 1 called the police. It would turn out the inside man, the person responsible for Rodrigo's assassination, was Rodrigo himself. He had been devastated by the assassination not only of his client Musa, but of Musa's daughter Marjorie. As Rodrigo had secretly told his son Eduardo and his friend Luis, Rodrigo was deeply in love with Marjorie, and they were planning to get married as soon as Marjorie divorced her husband. The wedding ring that Rodrigo had been wearing at the time of his death, and when he was seen on camera in the YouTube murder video, had been a gift from Marjorie just before she was killed. The raw grief Rodrigo felt over the senseless killing of the woman he loved, along with his absolute conviction that the hit on Musa had been planned by a corrupt president, his wife, and personal secretary, had combined to create a feeling of total hopelessness in Rodrigo's head. At some point early in Rodrigo's investigation into Musa's assassination, Rodrigo realized that even if he could prove his allegations of corruption against the government, there was no way that anyone that high up in government would ever be charged or punished for their crimes. So early in May, Rodrigo, crushed by despair, came up with a plan that would both end his own personal misery and, he hoped, would set Guatemala on the road to real reform. It would be a suicide dressed up to look like an assassination. And with the video he planned to make before his death, Rodrigo hoped that his staged assassination would result in a bloodless coup that would take down the presidency of Alvaro Colom. So it was Rodrigo who had contacted his wife's cousins, the owners of the giant pharmaceutical company, and told them that he wanted to arrange a hit on an extortionist, a man, he told them, who had been after Rodrigo for money. His cousins had agreed, never once suspecting that the extortionist was actually Rodrigo himself. And the trusted lieutenant that Rodrigo had asked to go buy the 2 prepaid cell phones, that was Rodrigo's trusted bodyguard/driver. Rodrigo had made sure one of those 2 prepaid phones was delivered to the hitmen, and he used the other phone to make threatening calls to his own personal cell phone, and to give his killers his own personal description and to tell them exactly when and where they could find and kill him. And so on the morning of his own death, when Rodrigo saw the man in jeans and a jacket running toward him, he knew it was his killer. So he just pulled over, sat on the curb, and waited to be killed. As for the 18-minute-long YouTube murder video, the insurance policy that guaranteed Rodrigo's allegations of corruption could not be swept under the rug, that was produced by Guatemala's top spy and Rodrigo's friend, Luis, with the help of one of Luis's contacts in Guatemala's right-wing press. Although he eventually admitted his hand in making the video, Luis claimed he had no idea that Rodrigo was planning his own assassination. It is possible that Rodrigo's identity as the inside man might have gone undiscovered, except for the security footage that led investigators to the owner of that black Mazda, and the fact that Rodrigo's bodyguard made a critical mistake that linked the prepaid cell phones to his boss. When the bodyguard purchased those two burner phones, he did what Rodrigo said not to. He signed his name on one of the sales tax slips and submitted that slip of paper with his faded signature on it to a secretary at Rodrigo's law office. Even though Rodrigo's videotaped allegations of widespread government corruption were true and resulted in the CICIG removing hundreds of corrupt government officials from their jobs, it would turn out Musa Khalil's assassination and the unintended murder of his daughter Marjorie were not the work of Guatemalan government officials. Just as Guatemala's one honest lawyer was prepared to stage an assassination that could send his own cousins to prison, apparently the honest and incorruptible Musa was buying contraband from criminal networks for use in his textile factory. When Musa refused to pay those suppliers, they had him killed. Once Judge Castrosana released his findings and named Rodrigo as his own killer, the CICIG and government brought charges against Rodrigo's cousins, as well as the 10 members of the criminal gang that helped facilitate the hit. As for President Colom, the YouTube murder video scandal would end up actually strengthening his presidency. His decision to turn over the investigation into Rodrigo's death to a third party, the CICIG, and wait for their report, gave him the public appearance of being a calm and confident leader. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to tint the 5-star review button's car windows free of charge, and then when they say yes, spray paint all of their windows black. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please